All right, good evening, everybody. If I could call everybody to order. It's great to see so many folks here, and I see a lot of new faces, at least new to me. My name is Patrick Spiro. I'm the CEO of the American Philosophical Society, and I'm thrilled to welcome everybody here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have in a few moments. I thought I might say a few things about the APS, who we are and what we do. I know some of you may be new to the Society, and I was also inspired by the panel that we just heard talking about philosophical societies, especially Mike Gunther's papers. So I decided to take a few minutes and put together a little PowerPoint that tells a little bit about the APS and our history. People down here are nervous that I'm going to talk too long. They're looking at me strange. But so, the American Philosophical Society, who were we? We were founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 with the mission of promoting useful knowledge. And I think this proposal that he wrote really captures a lot of what was discussed in the earlier panel and probably will continue throughout tomorrow. But that is, why did he form the APS? And it wasn't just Franklin, it was a group of other civically minded individuals. They said, first off, there are all these discoveries that are being made that could help mankind. But the problem, which you can see there in the second paragraph, is that these remain uncommunicated, they die with their discoverers, and are lost to mankind. So all this incredible new knowledge that could help mankind is being lost because it's not being communicated or shared with others. And that really gets at the heart of what the Society does, has done, and continues to do. This is Franklin's solution. This is the outline of the American Philosophical Society circa 1743. So what does he say the APS should do? First off, it needs to elect members, the virtuosi, he says, who are supposed to maintain a constant communication. The idea is that North America, the colonies, the British colonies in North America, are so dispersed that the leading thinkers in each community are not able to connect with their peers that may be 100, 200, 300 miles away. So they want to elect these leading thinkers so they can create a network to share knowledge amongst themselves. And of course, this knowledge is going to be shared at meetings held here in Philadelphia, kind of like we're having a meeting here where we have great thinkers coming together to share their knowledge with each other. You can see there that they're to communicate with each other, and then what they learn in these meetings here in Philadelphia are then supposed to be sent out along this network to people far and wide. In the 18th century, the technology for disseminating knowledge was publications, and so we continue to operate the longest scholarly imprint in North America. The director of the press is back there, Kim Gwinta, and books are available for sale. But you can see there in the spirit of the paper, Mike's, the correspondence was also supposed to happen with the Royal Society and the Dublin Society that is now the Royal Dublin Society. A fun piece, we provide prizes that recognize science. We operate the longest continuously operating prize in science in the United States. It's the Magellanic Premium. And in the spirit of the question at the last panel about scientists, this is how that prize is defined. It is for someone, the best discovery or most useful invention relating to navigation, astronomy, or natural philosophy, mere natural history accepted. Something to think about what they meant there. And then finally, Franklin proposed research, the direct support of research. And I think this is one of Franklin's innovations. Franklin was a tinkerer. I don't know the Royal Society saying in their charter that they were going to raise dues in order to support research directly. But that's something Franklin added to our proposal. And so we've been pushing the boundaries of knowledge for almost 300 years. We financed one of the first archaeological digs, Charles Wilson Peale in Newburgh, excavating the Mastodon. That was supported in part by the American Philosophical Society. We're part of many of the exploring expeditions of the 19th century. In the 20th century, we developed a grants program that I hope you all are aware of and may apply to, or maybe you're a former recipient of a grant and fellowship. And you can see there the areas that we've supported research on all 7 continents of the globe. Our motto, which you can see on this seal here, is Nullo Discriminate. We support research in all fields of knowledge. We don't discriminate. We believe all knowledge can be useful. And we continue to evolve as science and knowledge evolves. And one of our newest areas of funding is in astrobiology, really pushing into the final frontier of knowledge. So today, when people ask me what we do, and it was so nice to, in Mike's talk, philosophical societies, everybody knew what a philosophical society was in the 18th century. Today, when people meet me, they say, what do you do? I say, oh, I'm I run the American Philosophical Society. They say, oh, you must be a philosopher. And I say, no, I'm a historian. And when I was librarian earlier, they said, oh, you're the librarian for philosophers. I said, no, I'm a historian, not a librarian, and I don't study philosophy. Actually, what the APS does are these three things. We produce new knowledge, we preserve important ideas, and we promote promising ideas. And I think that is one of the things that we're doing today with this conference, is really promoting and disseminating really promising new research. And I'm thrilled to be able to be a part of this conference. And I want to thank our partners, the College of Physicians and the Science History Institute, for also being a part of these conversations. Now, on to the conversation that we're going to have about the 250th anniversary and the role of the history of science in this anniversary. I know a lot of people are thinking about the Declaration of Independence, but there's a lot more to that story, and that's what we're going to hear about this evening. And to host that, moderate this conversation is Sara Ray, who's the Senior Director of Interpretation and Engagement at the College of Physicians in Philadelphia. She previously held positions at the Science History Institute down the street and at the University of Pennsylvania. She has a PhD in the history of science and sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. And she's held a number of distinguished fellowships, including from the Fulbright, the Descartes Center at Utrecht University, and the Smithsonian Institute. Sara?
All right, hello everyone. So I won't take up any of your time except for to introduce a panel of folks who are not only distinguished, but that I'm really excited to call colleagues and longtime friends. So this feels like a really exciting, opportunity to hear from people that I've been lucky to work with professionally and get to know socially for a number of years now. So as they are sitting down here, I'm just going to go, left to right. We'll start here with Dr. Judith Kaplan, who's a public historian of science at the Science History Institute. Judy is the public historian of science at the Science History Institute, where she develops resources that help public audiences look at the world from the perspective of the history of science. She received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her work has been supported by the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. So, Judy, everyone. Next, we have Dr. Adrianna Link, Curator of the History of Science at the American Philosophical Society. Whoa, wow. Okay, so now it's a competition. Who gets the most claps? Judy didn't know she was competing, but she is. So Adrianna received her PhD in the history of science from the Johns Hopkins University, where she specialized in the history of 20th century anthropology. Her scholarship on this topic has been published in several journals and edited volumes, and she is currently completing a book manuscript on the history of urgent anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution. And then over there on the right, we have my colleague, Dr. Erin McLeary, the Senior Director of Collections and Research at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. She has previously worked at the Science History Institute. There we go. Come on. Yeah, there we go. We'll try this again at the end and see where we land. All right, now Erin's playing the crowd. All right, so this has turned into a very different panel very quickly. So Erin has previously worked at the Science History Institute, the National Constitution Center, and even the museum here at the APS. Erin received her PhD in the history and sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania and has published on the history of American medical museums, chemistry, and color theory. And you thought we were done, but we're not. There is, in fact, an unseen participant right here, although I will soon take a seat, and that's Dr. Jesse Smith, who will be joining us on Zoom, who's the Director of Curatorial Affairs and Digital Content at the Science History Institute. So he oversees interpretive projects in the public history of science and technology. Jesse received his PhD in the history and sociology of science from the University of Pennsylvania, so you might be sensing a bit of a theme here. He was the curator of Downstream, an exhibition on the history of water analysis and protection, and Lunchtime, the history of science on the school food tray, which examined the history of efforts to feed U.S. school children for more than a century. So this is a really just dynamic group of folks, and I'm just not going to belabor it anymore and hand it right over to Judy to start us off.
Thanks, Sara. Can everyone hear me? Good. Right. So I'm going to start off with a kind of framing for our discussion this evening on science and American life. And so I'm going to invoke science and American life as a case study in the public history of science. So this is an exhibition that was held at the Smithsonian Institution. It was open to the public from 1994 to 2011. So clearly not a revolutionary era project, and also not one that was really motivated by a major commemorative event. So you might be wondering, why are we talking about this? I do think it's important. I think the history of this exhibition sheds light on some of the opportunities and challenges of sharing the history of science with public audiences in the US. So that's why I'm going to talk about it. I think it's a useful point of reference for the discussion that we're going to have this evening. So I want to ask a question. I'm not going to give you time to answer it because I think we're a little short on time. And that is, what do you think of when you think of science in this country over the last 250 years? So I was taking notes over the course of the afternoon. And so some things you might say would be naval medicine, metallurgy, mental health, seed collecting, networks, guinea grass and translation, and also ocean. So really wide-ranging subjects. This is not what curators imagined broad public audiences would be thinking about when they came to science and American life. So they were working with a different interval of time. This is the question that tour guides would pose to people who were first coming to the museum for a guided tour through the exhibition. And they would ask, what do you think of when you think of science in the last 125 years? So what did they think that people would say? They said this. This is from the script that tour guides were given. They were imagining that people would think about the splitting of the atom, the discovery of penicillin, cracking the genetic code, the inventions of lasers and synthetic materials, things like nylon, also putting a man on the moon. So really big marquee type events. And I just want to use this as a way of introducing the exhibition for anyone who isn't already familiar with it. It was a 12,000 square foot permanent exhibition that was held at the Smithsonian. A massive undertaking comprised of, by the end of things, 900 objects, 600 historical photos and graphics, as well as numerous computerized and interactive displays. It was 4 years in the making and drew on the coordinated labor of some 75 full-time staff. That's kind of mind-boggling for me to think about. In an external partnership, so this is the an early draft of the floor plan of the museum exhibition. And this is an indication of some of the people who were behind it. So this was a partnership that was sort of novel at the time. It was largely actually paid for by the American Chemical Society, which donated some $5.3 million to put on the exhibition. So they wanted to do something sort of different with this exhibition. They didn't want to talk about penicillin. They didn't want to talk about splitting the atom necessarily. They wanted to do this. They wanted to approach science through the lens of American history. So what did that mean? The goal, in other words, was to show audiences that the history of science was more than a chronicle of experiments and achievements. Rather, the goal of the curators was to show audiences that the history of science could offer a way of looking at the US society, a tool, perhaps, for greater self-understanding. What motivated this undertaking, and what did stakeholders hope to achieve? For its part, the American Chemical Society's Committee on Public Affairs and Public Relations was eager to combat what they saw as the crisis of scientific illiteracy. Citing surveys conducted by the National Science Foundation, they pointed out that only 1/8 of Americans understand the scientific process. Only 1/4 understand basic scientific terms and ideas, and only 1/2 comprehend the bearing that science has on people's everyday lives. ACS members were shopping around for a way to promote science literacy while simultaneously holding up what they called positive role models that might counteract negative public opinion and inspire youth to careers in chemistry. The ACS had considered various alternative formats before settling on a partnership with the Smithsonian. It is important to pay attention to these alternative venues and formats because, as I think our panelists can attest, the medium of communication is bound up with the message when it comes to the public-facing projects in the history of science. So you see here one of the fleet of laboratories on wheels that ACS members used to bring chemical demonstrations to underserved rural communities. These plans were eventually set aside in favor of a more centralized collaboration with the Smithsonian. History, leadership seems to have decided, was a better way to go after American hearts and minds. The motives of the funders, in this case, the ACS, were often in tension with the narrative Smithsonian curators wanted to present about science and American life. In a nutshell, the curators wanted to tell a story about the dynamic co-constitution of American science and American society. Curator Arthur Malella worked it out this way in a 1992 to a member of the exhibition's advisory board, somebody who was sort of disapproving of how things were going at the time. He said, quote, "There is no question that the public attitudes towards science have shifted over the course of the past century, and especially since the war. Citizens today want to know more about science, especially its place in their daily lives, and our exhibit attempts to address this need honestly and in a balanced manner. Your letter has reminded me of something very important, that the most significant interaction between science and society involves the fundamental differences in the way people perceive science. There is no such thing as a complete public consensus. Your letter has made me see how important it is to address quite directly the existence of these powerful, often contradictory opinions and their role in shaping the science-society relationship," end quote. Malella used a word here that came up over and over again in debates about the exhibition, and that is balance. While he claimed balance for the exhibition, members of the ACS worried loudly and consistently that the narrative was in fact unbalanced, that it presented negative stories through objects like this fallout shelter, which crowded out positive stories, say concerning the lives saved through nuclear medicine. What are the exhibition's audience? Both parties, the Smithsonian and the ACS, seem to think that the exhibition had the power to provoke action. Future scientists and citizens capable of making good choices about resource allocation were among their target audiences. As they were developing the script, Smithsonian staff conducted focus groups and surveys that indicated they needed to do more to engage audiences from minoritized groups. Private correspondence, archived by the ACS, dismissed such efforts as counterproductive political correctness. Finally, a kind of segue into our discussion of the nation's 250th. It is important to consider the context or milieu in which negotiations over science and American life took place. The so-called science wars, which funders associated largely with the environmentalists, were a key part of this context. They extended to questions about vaccine safety that are alive and well today. Another key element of the story was the very public fight over how the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, was to be exhibited at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. This fight hung like a cloud over the development of science in American life. A story covering the opening of the exhibition for US News and World Report went to Newt Gingrich for a quote, who made the association explicit. He celebrated the successful efforts of veterans groups to have language about the devastation brought by the Enola Gay taken down, saying, quote, "You are seeing a reassertion and a renewal of American civilization. The Enola Gay fight was a fight, in effect, over the reassertion by most Americans that they're sick and tired of being told by some cultural elite that they ought to be ashamed of their country," end quote. This could be read, in a sense, as a history of the present. I'll leave the story there, but we'll conclude with a few questions that it raises, questions that might serve as touchstones or prompts for our discussion tonight. First, we can ask, what meanings were attributed to science, history, and America in this case, and how might these be operationalized at the US 250th? Second, what would constitute literacy in the public history of science? This is something I'm particularly interested in. In other words, what do any of us want the public to know about or take away from the history of science? And finally, how does setting, funding, audience, content, and milieu conspire to make certain interventions possible or impossible, in this case, or in programming for the 250th? So with that, I'll hand it over to Adrianna.
Okay. You'd think I would know how to work this podium, given how many events I've worked here, but we'll see how it goes. Thanks so much, everybody, for sticking around. I'm really excited about this conference, and wanted to also thank Judy and Jesse for coming up for the framework for this conversation. I'm really excited to continue this now and at the History of Science Society meeting later in November. But with that, and with this framing in mind, I'd like to turn to a project that we're working on here at the American Philosophical Society as part of our 250th endeavors, and that is a project called America's Scientific Revolutionaries. So we've been talking a lot today about various folks who might fall into this category. So what is this initiative that we're doing? So it is a 2-year project funded very generously by the Lounsbury Foundation to profile lesser-known scientists who were active during the Revolutionary era. The goal of the project is to develop content that really explores the significance of scientific thought and innovation in the formation of the United States for a broad range of audiences and age groups. So we're thinking here not just of historians of science and early Americanists, and many of the folks who are in the room today, but general audiences, kids really thinking about how do we reach 10 to 14-year-olds who might be interested in these topics, and how can we develop resources that might be used not just in history classrooms, but scientific classrooms as well. And then the task of this, of course, is to situate this conversation about the public history of science alongside larger regional, national, and international initiatives that are being planned around 2026. APS has been doing this for a little bit now. Some of these conferences I was actually involved with coordinating, and of course the one today is part of this conversation as well. This all kind of leads up right now to our current exhibition, The Revolutionary City, as well as the Revolutionary City portal, which is available online, and does include some of the folks that I'll be talking about this evening. But what I've kind of came to realize is that conversations about science, natural philosophy, as we might talk about it now, really wasn't the highlight of these projects. It was talking about the Declaration, it was talking about loyalists, it was talking about other folks. So where does the history of science fit in this conversation that we're having about the Revolutionary City? So thanks to generous support from the Richard Lounsbury Foundation, which coincided with the launch of the Center for the History of Science last July, we were able to make this our inaugural project. And I think it's a really appropriate one for all of the reasons that Patrick outlined at the beginning of this talk. The APS has been involved in the history of science and the documentation of the history of science for a long time. So we can think about this project as a way to think about those early connections, but I think also think about how the Center for the History of Science in its nascent form can use these connections to engage with topics in the present. So really thinking about what does it mean to promote useful knowledge in this kind of broader Franklinian mindset. And this conference and this project, I think, also builds on observations made by early American historian of science Whitfield Bell, who was also librarian and executive officer of the APS. And I was reading this book as sort of inspiration for this conversation today, and think it really resonates still with the present. So I will read it quickly. Happily, it is hardly necessary any longer to argue that science is an important element of modern culture. Most scholars recognize that scientific ideas and achievements may affect any aspect of the life of the community, and that science itself, far from being something transcendent or self-contained, is influenced by prevailing philosophies and current economic and political conditions. So kind of file that in the back of your head for all of our conversations tonight. So building on Judy's questions, I think this project also offers some other ones. So how can the stories of revolutionary scientists speak to ongoing and evolving complexities about the relationship between science and society? And then what are the tools or perspectives that the history of science specifically offers to public commemorations around moments like the 250th? And then I would say, too, just keeping in mind that Philadelphia, the revolutionary city, is also the epicenter for both a lot of the conversations around 2026 and the history of science. And I'm so grateful to be here with partners who are in the city of Philadelphia also working on these ideas. Okay, so just very quickly to tell you a little bit about the process. As you might imagine, how do you begin to identify which individuals to even profile as part of this project? So we had a robust series of tools that we used, many developed by Jeff Applehans, who's at the back of the room. So if you have questions about any of it, please ask him. But used a large series of bespoke AI and language learning models to kind of whittle down a large set of APS members who are active during the age of revolutions, many of whom have been talked about today. Also had conversations about how do we measure the impact of these people. You know, it's fine if they're a lesser known, but we want to find people who actually did something and we're not just kind of not household names. And then also thinking about, what is the APS connection? Do we even have stuff to tell the stories that we want to tell as part of this project? And ultimately, that became the thing that really drove the project, is who are the people with whom we can tell a good story about the history of science in the 18th century? So we settled on these 6 people who you've heard about earlier if you were here. So again, this room of folks probably doesn't think of these as lesser knowns, but our hopes is that once this project continues to disseminate, it actually will reach quite a few folks who have not heard of these names. So David Rittenhouse to think about questions of astronomy, Joseph Priestley to think about pneumatic chemistry, the Bartrams, and especially John and William, to think about the relationship between botany and natural history and exploration, Benjamin Rush, along with Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, to think about the 1793 yellow fever epidemic and its relation to medicine and public health, Catherine Haynes, who was a 15-year-old Quaker woman here in Philadelphia, who's been a really fantastic person to think about the network of women healers, and then James Madison, who we'll come back to, obviously founding father, drafter of the Constitution, but also a climate scientist and meteorologist in his own right. So here they are. Our first set of phase 1 was to produce a series of short-form educational videos. These are all on our website, so check out through the Center for the History of Science if you want to watch them. We developed these with Makematic. It was a really fun and exciting process. I'm going to play one for you really quickly right now.
Have you ever wondered how far away stars really are? Today, we know more about the size of the cosmos than ever. But it was the work of 18th century mathematician and inventor David Rittenhouse that helped astronomers understand the scale of our solar system. Born near Germantown, Pennsylvania in 1732, Rittenhouse was a curious kid who loved science and math. At 19, he opened a shop as a clockmaker, gaining a reputation for his attention to detail. Rittenhouse was also passionate about astronomy, building one of the colony's first telescopes, as well as several observatories, including at his family farm and outside the Pennsylvania State House, now called Independence Hall. In 1769, scientists worldwide prepared for the transit of Venus, a rare event when Venus passes between Earth and the Sun, visible as a small dot. This event wouldn't happen again for over 100 years. By accurately measuring how long Venus took to cross the Sun, astronomers could calculate the distance between Earth and the Sun. Many individuals and institutions across the globe worked together on the project. In Philadelphia, the American Philosophical Society asked Rittenhouse to help lead their efforts, because he understood the complex calculations and could build the necessary instruments. Precision was everything. A single mistake could ruin the calculation. When the moment arrived on June 3, 1769, Rittenhouse reportedly fainted from the stress of working on such an important astronomical moment. Despite this, his measurements, combined with global observations, would later help establish the astronomical unit, the definitive measure of distance from the Earth to the Sun. At a time when calls for American independence were growing, Rittenhouse demonstrated that Americans were also revolutionary scientists.
Great, so you can, thanks. So you can see the appeal of these. They're short, they're fun, they're informative. They speak in a history classroom and a science classroom, and they do exactly what we want them to do. But as we realize, there's a lot of things you want to say about a person that you can't say in a 2 to 3 minute long video. So phase 2 is growing on that. So the next phase of the project is going to be to host a series of programs around the country with contemporary scientists who will be using these 6 individuals as touch points to think about the ongoing significance of their work in the present day. And the first of these is scheduled for November 11th. So please check our website. Registration will be open soon, and that will be with Kim Prather talking about Joseph Priestley. So it's going to be fantastic. It is hybrid, so anybody here can watch it. It'll be probably 7 o'clock Eastern time because it'll be in California. So check back soon. The other portion of this project is an ongoing blog series. So obviously we could only limit ourselves to 6. We're still thinking about other ways to feature other revolutionary scientists as part of this project. One of these is our blog, and Vince Femia, who's here, Vince Wave, is the one kind of running the show on that. So please check out this fantastic blog series, again, through our website. So just to wrap up, I have a couple takeaways. So this project has made me realize, despite the fact that I'm not an early Americanist, that the stories and struggles of 18th century natural philosophers remain eerily relevant, as Whit Bell kind of told us from the beginning, that employing the tools of history of science provides us with additional opportunities for engaging audiences across the sciences and the humanities, but that the history of science also offers a useful context for understanding the founding of the United States, and especially reinforces the close ongoing connection between science and society that we've heard about so much today, and can keep in check some of the progress narratives that sometimes slip through the cracks in sort of more general curriculum. So, you know, this here I have Madison's weather diaries in conversation with some current headlines. But what I like about the Macmatic videos too is that we're able to talk a little bit about the complexities of who was doing the labor to enable that work. So the final point then is that the work of both science and public history of science is necessarily collaborative, that multiple perspectives are essential. So I just want to conclude by thanking my team, Jeff Appelhans, Gina Sarita, now Pungello, Chris Roy, Vince Femia, Michelle, Patrick, Brenna, and everyone else who's been involved with the project. So thank you again so much, and really looking forward to the discussion. And I'll turn it over to our friend online who's going to talk about another 2026 initiative.
Am I up? Okay, I'm having a little trouble hearing people when they're away from the mic, but I'm going to share my screen and get started. Can folks see this? Yep. Yes. Okay, great. Well, thank you, and apologies that I'm not able to make it to the conference. I'm actually at a fireworks conference out in California, working on this exhibition that you see before you, Flash Bang Boom, A History of Fireworks. And this is the Science History Institute's contribution to the 250th. What you're looking at here is what's called a display firework. This is the inside of a firework that you would see at a big show in Philadelphia, New York. It's not the kind of firework the kind of consumer firework that you or I could buy. And I show this because I think it's a very evocative object in its own right. But it's also really rich for me as a museum object, because the kind of spare appearance of this, right? There's just a couple of materials, there's just a couple of colors. Stands in stark contrast to all of the histories that are embedded in this object. And
Hey, Jesse,
in
just
doing
Jesse?
research for this
Sorry.
exhibition.
Sorry, Jesse. I think, can you get into presenter mode? We're seeing your just like kind of slideshow layout, so we haven't switched the slide.
Oh, okay.
So we're okay. That's the right one, but we just want to make sure we're getting the right visual. Hold on 1 second. Are you in presentation mode?
Is that slideshow?
Yeah, go up to slideshow. Up top.
Okay. Sorry.
Oh wait, hold on. He's got someone out in the. Change the share on Zoom to what?
Share the full screen of that slide.
Share the full screen of that slide. Down in the bottom of Zoom, we have a very helpful, the green share button of Zoom. Zoom. Down. Down at the bottom, the green share button, yeah. And then hit that little caret. Little share, no, back to Share? Or you can just scroll, whatever. Yeah, so we're on the object. Just make sure to kind of scroll down. Yeah, we're perfect. All right, thank you, Jesse.
I'm really sorry. I'm not able to see folks, and I don't know if you're speaking to me or someone in the room.
No, I'm speaking to you. So yeah, just make sure to like kind of click down the objects. Yeah. I'll be back. But yeah, keep going.
Okay, in this mode? Okay. Okay, apologies. Let me move through really quickly to share some of the objects that are in this exhibition. And just to say that in doing this research, a lot of really canonical questions and concerns in the history of science have emerged, things that are going to be very familiar to this group, but are going to be less familiar and hopefully surprising to folks outside of our discipline. So we're drawing from our rare book collection, both here at SHI, but also from peer institutions. What you're looking at here is an image from an early 1600s manual for recreational fireworks. This is one of the earliest distinctions between pyrotechnics for militaristic purposes and those used exclusively for church ceremonies, court ceremonies, and things like that. This is an 1811 handbook written in France by the member of an Italian fireworks family, introducing a lot of the elements of fireworks that we're familiar with today, things like color, different kinds of effects, French images of fireworks, the kinds of things we don't see today, but that were quite new at the time. This is a small manual that we believe was a one-off with instructions for how to make different kinds of effects, both the chemical composition of fireworks, but also the different armatures that could be made to create different kinds of effects. This is another book from the early 1800s, which offers instructions on fireworks, but also other kinds of effects using new technologies of air and water. So really interesting in thinking about how different kinds of technologies are grouped or separated over time. We're looking at other kinds of pyrotechnical experiences as well, too. These are programs from early 20th century performances called pyrotheatrics, which were large reconstructions of historical events, including actors, along with pyrotechnics. And one of our goals is really to hopefully surprise visitors by showing them, again, the kinds of fireworks that have existed across history that are not what we encounter today. We're also working on some possible programming to bring some of these kinds of effects to the public next summer as part of Philadelphia's broader celebrations. What's been really interesting about this project is that the history of fireworks, at least in the United States in the 19th and 20th century, is not at all very well represented in museums, archives, and libraries. So we've been going out to the industry. That's one of the reasons that I'm here in California today, to try to find objects, archival materials, photographs that are sitting in attics, in basements. There are still several multi-generational fireworks families. Much of the American fireworks industry, the knowledge of fireworks came with Italian immigrants at the turn of the 20th century, and several of those families are still in this business today. They no longer manufacture. 99% of fireworks are manufactured in China today, but they are still in what's called the display business of putting on performances. So we've been going out and trying to gather those kinds of assets to show these early forms of manufacturing, different kinds of displays, different kinds of artwork. These are what are called set displays. So armatures that would have been on the ground. This was a phenomenon that really died out in the 50s and 60s as the skill was lost, but also as folks were desiring larger and larger fireworks show that required more aerial shots. Examples of fireworks that have been used in political campaigns. This was an aerial effect from the Nixon Lodge campaign of 1960. Fireworks of LBJ's profile from the 68 DNC convention in Atlantic City. We're also really trying to tease out all the different elements of putting on a fireworks show. And One of the organizing concepts we have for this is not to proceed chronologically, but to proceed according to the different elements of a fireworks show: making, designing, selling. This is from one of those families, a briefcase that was used several years ago, or several decades ago, with order forms, contracts, and things like that. So one of the things we also try to do in our exhibitions is kind of make interesting pairings. So there's something fun and exciting about fireworks, but then you also have something more seemingly mundane, like a briefcase. And I'm really seduced by those kinds of pairings and presenting those to visitors. I don't think people necessarily walk into an exhibition on the history of fireworks and expect to see paperwork and a briefcase. So just to say, these are some of the, again, the key history of science questions that we feel like we're able to bring out in this exhibition. There's a lot of category work happening both across history, but even today. I've been to many of these meetings, and I hear these terms, amateur, hobbyist, professional, licensed, trained, being thrown around. One of the industry is very concerned with safety and with dangerous or too powerful fireworks getting into consumer hands, and they're actually trying to refine what counts as a professional for the purposes of gaining access to different categories of fireworks. Likewise, categories of art, science, and technology are really blurry here, and also the way we classify fireworks according to DOT hazard codes for transportation. There's also a lot of really interesting ways in which federal oversight over fireworks maps onto very distinct agencies: DOT, Consumer Product Safety, ATF, FAA, and so on. Again, familiar to us, interesting questions about how safety and risk are determined. I can go into, people in this room have already heard me talk about standards around fuse time. We probably don't have the time for that now. But then also really interesting things that we can do with periodizations, right? One of the interesting things to me about this concept of organizing according to the different elements of a fireworks show is that we're not proceeding chronologically, but actually within each of those categories, we can offer different periodizations, so starting at different times in order to help offer visitors a different kind of museum experience that they might not encounter when they're encountering a chronological display. To the point of this roundtable, we're also thinking very deliberately about our location. There's a lot of benefits to all of us in Philadelphia by what we anticipate to be heightened visitation in 2025, or I'm sorry, 2026, not only because of the milestone, but also World Cup games. But really want to think about, okay, well, how are visitors encountering this particular content when they're also seeing these other historical sites, right? Really trying to situate ourselves in their shows, not only in terms of where they are in Philadelphia, but also what does it mean to encounter this content in a museum that this is our permanent exhibition that really explores the history of chemistry and chemical engineering. So try to be as thoughtful as possible as we can about how we're situating the visitor in our content. And one of the ways in which I've been thinking about this work more broadly, public history of science, is trying to be really deliberate about thinking about the relationships between the content we have, largely our collections, but also the things that we borrow or the things that we bring in through text or image or other media. Also, what is the concept? And I think so often in public history, there's not a differentiation between content and concept. And I think those dual registers is really important for making impactful public history, but then also being really aware of the medium or the platform or the space, right? And not just thinking of a podcast or a gallery as a bucket to be filled, but thinking about what are the affordances, what are the challenges of that particular medium or platform for realizing the content and concept that we're developing, and thinking about how the three of those together really lead to what the possible intervention can be. Again, I see the history of fireworks as a way of bringing folks into the way historians of science thinking about this as an orientation, right? And thinking about this as an orienting experience. But I'm really open to conversations about whether this milestone, this year, this particular climate necessitates other kinds of interventions. So I will leave it there, and apologies for the technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Yeah, we were able to see everything, so thanks for bearing with us. And yeah, last but not least, we've got Erin McLeary, and then we're going to keep it to just kind of one quick panel question and one audience question. So start thinking of your very good audience question now and how you are going to perform to earn that one coveted audience question spot.
Thank you. Is the mic appropriate for me? All right. So just quick note about my slides. I'm going to use a lot of images of historical documents. If there's something I want to draw your attention to, there's going to be a red arrow. I am not going to be reading these blocks of text, and neither should you. Okay. So the outbreak of unidentified deadly pneumonia in Philadelphia during the 1976 bicentennial celebrations generated feverish coverage in the media, a flurry of conspiracy theories, a frenzy of fast-paced epidemiological investigations happening at the local, state, and federal level, even congressional hearings. Deemed the epidemic of the century in 1976, this outbreak is now largely forgotten, even in Philadelphia. So when we at the Motor Museum, a museum of medical history, chose the 50th anniversary of this outbreak as our 2026 project, the question of why the outbreak was simultaneously so terrifying at the time and now so roundly forgotten was one that we wanted to explore. The outbreak is so historically inconsequential now that few people have even tried to answer this question of why it's been forgotten, gesturing vaguely at the overwhelming 1980s public health crisis of HIV/AIDS, or the more spectacular symptoms of other emerging infectious diseases like Ebola. So from that perspective, we always knew that the subtext of this exhibition is memory, as Legionnaires remains a killer today. It's the leading cause of freshwater disease outbreaks in the United States. People have been sickened and died from cases linked to cooling towers, shower heads, decorative fountains, cruise ships, windshield wiper fluid tanks, and organ transplantation. It's a disease of aging infrastructure and a disease of under-resourced infrastructure, such as nursing homes or prisons. Cases are both believed to be underdiagnosed and also on the rise. Cases rose nearly 900% between 2000 and 2018. And in July just of this year, those of you who are reading national media might have seen that 114 people in Harlem were sickened with Legionnaires, 90 hospitalized, and 7 died. So the mysterious and frightening 1976 outbreak is worth remembering, and Legionnaires is a disease that deserves our attention. But events of the past few weeks have prompted me to try to use the 1976 outbreak to think more deeply about the intersections of the history of science, here specifically the history of public health, memory, and deliberate forgetting. And my thoughts on this are evolving and not fully formed, so just be nice in that one question that one of you is going to get. So what happened in 1976? From July 21st to 24th, Pennsylvania members of the American Legion gathered in Philadelphia for their annual statewide convention held at the stately Bellevue Stratford Hotel on Broad Street. Within days of the close of the convention, 11 Legionnaires who had been in Philadelphia, ranging in age 39 to 82, and now scattered across the Commonwealth back in their hometowns, were dead. Within a week, 130 convention attendees were hospitalized and 25 were dead. By November of 1976, the Bellevue Stratford, its sales plummeting, was forced to close. That same month, Congress convened hearings to grill the physicians, epidemiologists, and other officials desperately working to try to solve this mystery, which would not be solved until the following late December of that year. The outbreak deeply startled physicians and public health officials who believed in the post-war era of vaccines and antibiotics that the biggest public health threats that the nation faced were vaccine preventable and imminently treatable. And the sudden appearance of a deadly respiratory virus in Philadelphia rattled those confident and optimistic assumptions. So the backdrop of the Legionnaires' Convention was the 1976 year-long bicentennial celebration. As the nation's birthplace, Philadelphia was expected to be the epicenter of these national celebrations. Philly Mayor Frank Rizzo, a law and order Democrat who once called Nixon the greatest president of all time, was expecting ample federal support for Philly's celebration. And planners in Philly were anticipating a World's Fair-like exposition, multiple new structures, multiple new museums being built, and millions of visitors to Philadelphia. But by early August, the eyes of the nation were on Philly, not because of the bicentennial, but because of the unexplained deaths of the Legionnaires. And the bicentennial had already been proving to be kind of a bust, failing to attract both the federal dollars and the flood of visitors Rizzo and other planners had projected. As national coverage of the disease outbreak continued, several governors recommended that their citizens avoid travel to Philadelphia altogether. But bicentennial disappointments might also be attributed to Rizzo himself. Rizzo had repeatedly raised the specter of nameless, faceless leftist radicals who he claimed were plotting to descend in the thousands upon Philadelphia and disrupt the celebrations. He personally wrote President Ford requesting that 15,000 troops be deployed to Philadelphia to combat this enemy from within. And in the interest of time, I'm skipping my next paragraph, which is all about how Rizzo was an asshole, so we're just gonna stipulate that. We can get into details if you want. Rizzo's plan for the bicentennial also touched upon the practice of history itself. The city had endorsed 2 new museums to open in 1976, one focused on African American history, and one focused on the history of the Mummers, a group seen in 1976 as an exuberant continuation of 19th century white ethnic parade culture, later seen as a problematic celebration of blackface and minstrelsy, it's a hard word for me to say, and in more recent years, a tradition that flirts with blackface every now and then, but is actively working to be open and inclusive to more Philadelphians. And for those of you unfamiliar with the visual culture of the Mummers, you see here former Philadelphia Eagle Jason Kelsey wearing his Mummers costume during the Eagles' 2018 Super Bowl victory parade.
Go Birds.
Thank you. But when the federal funds that Rizzo was expecting did not fully materialize, Rizzo had moved in 1974 to completely slash plans for the city's African American History Museum to instead concentrate resources on the White Museum, the Mummers Museum, to shore up his white ethnic voting base. The Philadelphia Tribune, Philadelphia's black newspaper, caught wind, and a pressure campaign eventually forced Rizzo to change course. The museum eventually opened, but months after the Mummers Museum, and in a dreary location off the beaten path. And as the late summer of 1976 dragged into fall, the disinformation began. Russian propaganda agencies seized on the outbreak to push out English language articles and broadcasts linking Legionnaire's disease to deadly experiments allegedly being conducted by the CIA on unwitting American citizens. They might have been onto something. Prominent physicians challenged the very reality of the outbreak, including in the pages of the National Enquirer, which in the 1970s boosted a weekly circulation over 5 million readers. As one physician, a virologist at the FDA, charged in 1977, the CDC allowed a climate of fear to build to magnify their own importance. There was nothing to the outbreak. Both physicians quoted in that widely circulated article had long and public histories of anti-vaccination activism. And 50 years later, here we are again, with the history of a terrifying disease outbreak being deliberately and rapidly rewritten, with science being contested, with Black and inclusive history threatened with erasure in the name of national celebration, with a leader threatening to send troops into city streets to fight an imaginary foe. So we had initially planned to tell the story of the 1976 outbreak as an epidemiological mystery that baffled physicians and public health officials, an opportunity to use a fast-paced thriller to teach some basic scientific and public health concepts. But does pulling the lens out a little bit to focus on the context of the 1976 outbreak offer us opportunities to think more deeply about the intersections of contested science, contested histories, and contested ideas of American identity in the moments, these anniversaries of our nation's founding documents, that are supposedly meant to celebrate our union. And I want to end with a thought on place and pageantry. I've mentioned Philadelphia's Broad Street several times. Broad Street is Philadelphia's street of pageantry and spectacle. Broad Street is where the Mummers' annual New Year's parade is held. Broad Street is where the 2018 and 2025 Eagles Super Bowl victory parades were held. Frank Rizzo's monumental statue was just off Broad Street until it was removed by the city in the night of June 3rd during the city's 2020 uprisings. And if you've ever seen a news clip of a Philadelphia sports fan climbing a greased light pole after a sports victory, you've seen Broad Street. But Broad Street was also the site of the 1918 War Bonds Parade that fueled the fire of the influenza epidemic that killed over 12,000 Philadelphians in 2 months. And before Legionnaire's disease became codified as Legionnaire's disease, it was known as Broad Street pneumonia. So when we think critically about the commemoration of our national anniversaries, maybe another thing the 1976 outbreak can do is remind us that here in Philadelphia, we keep reaffirming concepts of community, belonging, and Americanness in the shadow of the statue of colonizer William Penn perched atop City Hall. And we keep forgetting how the very ways in which Broad Street draws us together has also historically made us vulnerable to a virus, to a bacillus, and sometimes to blackface. This is my extremely petty coda for like 6 of you in this audience.
Thank you to our panelists. And I know that we're running late on time and you guys have been here for a long day. So rather than asking the panelists a question myself, I'd rather just kind of give you guys the chance to, respond. So, again, kind of knowing that we're short on time, resist your urges, and find them later for a deeper dive. But who wants to, start us off with a question? Let's go. Oh, you got someone. Great. Okay.
Short questions, short answers. No question to the entire panel. Thank you.
I'll just throw this out there as a short question just to, think about. And Judy had phrased this question in the first panel of, how do we teach people about the history of science? And I think this is sort of the question, right? Because a lot of us like to complicate science and talk about how it's constructed and all of this. But we also like to say science is real and, don't throw it out the window. So how do we merge these messages and get at the messiness, get at the complexity in a landscape where we're really trying to also convince people of a kind of, the basic validity of science as a pursuit? And, in a sort of public-facing museum context. So more just throwing that out as sort of a question for all of us to ponder, but I'll move it on so other people get a chance.
Human stories.
That was the model right there. That was the model right there for the next 2 questions. Okay.
Philadelphia also had a major epidemic in 1793. And I have heard a rumor that that epidemic resulted in the final decision for the national capital to be moved down to the Potomac between 2 slave states instead of being an expansion of what it had been here. Is that a good theory or is that an exaggeration?
There's a great historian sitting right in front of you who actually could answer that question supremely well, but you should talk to him later.
It's an exaggeration. The answer was mentioned tonight. Somebody mentioned the show Hamilton. There's a song in Hamilton called The Room Where It Happened, and that explains why the capital moved down to D.C. It was political horse trading. It was not to do with the epidemic.
One last question. Anyone? Oop. Jeff is in the back. Show us how it's done, Jeff.
2 or 3 digit answer. This is for the whole panel. In early America, in the sort of period that we're talking about in the Revolution, science was seen as progress, as national. There was a patriotism to it. What is the approach that public institutions should take, scale of 1 to 100, I guess, in terms of promoting patriotism and nationalism during the 250th?
who wants to take that one first? Set the stand. I mean, yeah, just a scale, no explanation. Just
1 to 10. 1 to 10.
all right. I'll pick that. So I think that I'm just gonna give an answer and then justify it. I mean, I think my answer would be like a hot 8.5, and I think that it's our job as historians to really make an aggressive push for what it means to take ownership of this country. And if we want a different answer, then maybe I think that it's significant that all of us sort of had this, oh my God, reflex to that. And I think it's our call to take that seriously, a call to action to change what that might mean, and to make this a nation that we don't have that reflexive response to. So I think that that's not something that we can wait to happen. I think that we've seen that, the government is not going to do that for us, but we are fortunate as, leaders in nonprofit cultural institutions to have a position of power to connect with people in a way that I think is more important now than ever. So I say an 8.5, not from necessarily a place of pride, but from a place of obligation and ownership.
Sara, can I jump in on the first question?
Oh, Jesse.
Oh, Jesse's.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if folks can see me, but it sounds like you can hear me. I think that is the question for the public history of science today, and probably for as long as any of us are working in this field, and for a couple of reasons. One, I think that the public is not really familiar with the history of science. We were fortunate to recently have our school lunch exhibit covered by the New York Times, which is great coverage for us, right? High visibility, and they described us as a science museum. So I think we have to be really careful and thoughtful about meeting audiences where they are, and that's a bit what is behind that kind of formulation that I shared. And just as an example, I was recently in conversations, and I think some folks in this room were as well, about an opportunity to think about embedding some historical content, some history of science content into utility bills. And I was thinking, okay, if folks aren't maybe in that space expecting the history of science, what can you bring them? And I was thinking, well, what if we were to ask about the kilowatt hour? Why are we measuring your electricity like that, right? And it could lead to some kind of almost factoidy kind of thing. Outside of that setting, would I watch a documentary about the kilowatt hour, or would I want to go to a museum exhibition about that? Maybe not, but that content seems to me useful in that particular setting and making a kind of intervention that maybe helps people start to think, oh, wait, I take these categories for granted, or why do we measure the world in this kind of way? So I think that our interventions need to be highly bespoke, perhaps more so than ever, given the relationship that the public has with science at this moment. I mean, and to the point about the science is real, I live in a neighborhood with Erin and Judy where those signs are very prolific, and I get what is behind them. I mean, I would love to get to a place where that phrase actually raises more questions.
All right, final comments from the panel?
I just wanted to say one last thing to Jeff's question, and I think what working on America's scientific revolutionaries has taught me is that embracing science actually is patriotic. I mean, I think that point has come up time and time again in the panels that we heard today, that these things are not separated, and I think that all of us have exemplified that in different ways in our conversations today. The layers and complexities of that, I think vary over time, but I think that there is something inherently patriotic about being able to tell genuine histories of science.
And I think we will end it there for today.